Thank you all so much for coming to our panel today. Our panel, My City Smarter Than Yours, Deconstructing the Buzzwords, is largely about trying to figure out what exactly the terms that people use to describe open data platforms do. And I wish I could be there with you today. Unfortunately, I'm not able to make it to New Orleans this year, but I did want to kick off the panel with some preliminary thoughts that are meant to just mostly frame where we're trying to come from in this panel, and to frame some of the ideas that shaped my organization of this panel with Victoria Fast. So thank you all for coming again, and I'll just go ahead and kick it off and get started. So scholars, many of whom are around this table and in this room, have pointed to the increasing leverage of open data within smart cities initiatives. Around the world, the qualities, values, and meaning that policymakers and city administrators associate with smartness are somehow identified and isolated in open data platforms. Those qualities and values are maxim, a shibboleth, if not cliché. They're everywhere, and yet they're nowhere. Take the OECD, for example. In a 2013 report, the OECD describes the benefits of open data in the very common terms of accountability, transparency, responsiveness, democratic control, self-empowerment, participation, and engagement. Or the 2013 G8 Open Data Charter, which says, quote, information contains enormous potential to create more accountable, efficient, responsive, and effective governments and businesses. And this last part of that sentence is probably most important, to spur economic growth. The same goes for my own city of Calgary, where they promote their Open Calgary platform as improving, quote, openness, accountability, and transparency. Even much scholarly work on open data begins from the standpoint that open data do inherently increase accountability and transparency. This is often assumed or taken for granted in research, and those terms are thus left unquestioned at the same time as they are posited as self-explanatory and having fixed, positive, desirable meaning. What I want to challenge us to consider today is that these terms in themselves are meaningless and do not point to some universal or some original transparency or accountability that's out there and to which the terms refer. In this critique, I am drawing on Leclau and Mouffe's notion of the empty signifier, wherein a discourse is given geographically and historically contingent meaning through acts of power. So, when researchers, society, or governments forego critical analysis of the terms themselves, this constitutes a politics that complicates simple notions like we need to make cities more transparent through open data. Because the question then is, transparent how? On whose terms? By what conceptualization? To the benefit of whom? What's at stake here in this multifaceted critique is not merely the definitions of particular terms, but instead is the question of whether or not we as scholars should ever actually claim that open data is a good thing or start from that assumption. Taking its inherent goodness for granted masks the multiple contradictory meanings and purposes that open data can serve. It masks the ways that a claim to transparency and accountability always dynamically constitutes new meanings and new discursive regimes within which its meanings become contingently fixed. Transparency and accountability, as discourses, can just as easily serve the purposes of labor exploitation and digital colonialism as they can activism and social justice. Before continuing, let's look at a couple practical, tangible cases to make this a little bit more concrete. First, in the US, the organization Police Foundation, about this time last year, hosted a platform called the Public Safety Open Data Portal, now just called the Police Data Initiative. This open data platform was and remains opt-in for police stations around the country, and by their own description, they offer select data sets to better inform the general public of public safety in their communities. They claim that their platform, quote, improves transparency, accountability, and legitimacy. Of course, they're able to claim that their approach increases transparency despite a rather opaque approach because of the discursive apparatus that some data are better than no data. Yet, Any claims to transparency and accountability circumvent questions of histories of structural racism and classism that contextualize and produce the kinds of crime that policing is meant to prevent. It also evades the far more fundamental questions of whether communities need more transparent and accountable policing or simply less policing. In other words, open data's claims to transparency and accountability, in this case, work, and they work very well, towards some interests but against others. In more apparently benign uses, such as municipal open data platforms, cities lay claim to transparency and accountability by opening their data on such portals. The choice of which datasets to release is usually as opaque as in the previous case, and are usually based on platforms designed by for-profit companies, such as the ones you see in this slide. In other words, the city chooses the data by which you are to hold them accountable, an ironic and reinforcing of the pre-existing relation of power. And even then, only by releasing datasets on a website, a rather shallow conception of empowerment. One might protest by pointing to the cities that have adopted open by default policies, but even then we can draw on Nancy Fraser and Michael Warner to see how the fault lines of different publics affects social groups' access and use of open data. In an ongoing writing project, I leveraged Nancy Fraser's analysis of the public sphere and Michael Warner's counterpublics to explore the multiple layers of politics involved in open data. Even if all data, so let's go through this step by step. Even if all data have been released in an open by default city, which is a leap, but let's go with it, there's still the question of whether or not the city has even collected the most appropriate data. Let's say they did. Even then, one must have access to the internet and know that open data platforms exist. Say those conditions are met. Then the person must have the technical skills necessary to download and interact with the data set, which could be in some rather esoteric formats like a GeoJSON, comma separated values, or shapefile. Then they must have the qualitative and quantitative reasoning skills to mobilize sound analyses of the data. And even then, even at that point, to translate those findings into political agitation requires a large amount of social and political capital, as has been pointed out by Laura Robinson and Melissa Gilbert. Now, let's return to the original provocation. Open data platforms enable cities to claim transparency and accountability despite this remarkably limited audience who can effectively leverage the platforms. And so I remind us that these terms are empty signifiers that work for complex and contradictory interests. Now, let me take this one step further. The qualities, values, and meanings of the earlier terms, and thus of open data and smart cities, are thus relegated to the common sense. We can think of this through the work of James Ferguson and Tanya Murray Lee, in that they are now what James Ferguson and Tanya Murray Lee call an anti-politics. And in this conceptualization of anti-politics, Ferguson and Lee talk about the ways that social and political problems are reduced to technical issues that lend themselves well to technical solutions rather than more fundamental political problems. The anti-politics means that cities take open data contestations and politics out of the realm of the political and make them not subject to political critique. By not questioning and critiquing the terms, researchers and practitioners imply that they are inherently good things that need to be pursued. In other words, open data platforms are beyond contestation because they inherently improve these things we call transparency and accountability, which are in turn unquestionably good. To repeat myself from earlier, this is a political move, despite its claim to universality. The task for researchers, then, is to repoliticize those terms, to enshow the underlying assumptions, limitations, geographic contingency, and the social marginalization that mark claims to transparency, accountability, and empowerment in open data platforms. So, if open data and those qualities it claims are empty signifiers, are they worth pursuing? My answer is that yes, largely because my point is not that open data are bad or undesirable. Just that claims about open data's value and meaning need to be deconstructed. Open data platforms are still worth pursuing for many reasons, including the fact that governance of and with data is a critical issue for cities in 2018. In Calgary, for example, I've launched the YYC Data Collective, which is a platform for sharing data between nonprofit organizations, community associations, and charities in the city. My goal in that platform is not simply to collect more data for data's sake, but to observe whether or not data can improve the working conditions and efficacy of those third sector institutions. We hope that by creating institutional networks and collaborations across the city, we can better tackle the social and political problems we face. In this platform, organizations create the data to change the city, in contrast with the city's platform. In the city's platform, in contrast, the city produces the data and releases it to the public. In ours, we're going in the reverse. The public organizations and institutions are creating the data that they're circulating to citizens and the city. In conclusion, here I've remained largely on a polemical register, but I'm raising these issues because they're important research gaps that undermine a lot of the work that's going on in open data research and open data platforms. And I think we have the chance now to make significant theoretical contributions to smart cities and open data platforms by deconstructing the terms that much research takes for granted. So to reiterate, transparency, accountability, openness, responsiveness, these are all empty signifiers that take different forms in different contexts, playing into some interests and not others. The specific ways in which this happens empirically is the interesting question that we should be asking in our research. So in closing, I would just like to briefly mention and thank the University of Calgary Libraries and the Mellon Foundation. This research has been supported with a subgrant, a Mellon Foundation subgrant through the University of Calgary Libraries. So I'd like to thank them for their support in that. Thank you all for your time and attention as I've delivered these opening comments. I really hope that they have sufficiently set up the rest of the panelists here and help to get started this conversation that I think is very pressing for the field of open data research. And I encourage you to reach out with questions or comments or concerns, especially since I'm not able to be there in person. Please do send those via email, Facebook, Twitter, however you're able to reach me. I welcome your thoughts and feedback, and I look forward to seeing how this conversation unfolds in the future. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.